And I am so pleased to welcome you to the second day, if you will, of the Association of Jesuit Colleges and Universities Commitment to Justice Conference. We are very pleased and lucky to be able to have a question and response with Father Tom Smolich, who is joining us here. And if you haven't already, I would encourage you to watch his plenary speech on the topic of Ignatian spirituality, which can be found on the conference's YouTube channel. We'll throw a link down in the chat. Regardless, this will be a fantastic conversation. Before we proceed forward, though, I would be remiss if I did not take a moment, first and foremost, to stop to thank both Georgetown for hosting this event, but more explicitly, Andrea Whistler, who did the Herculean lift of not only planning an in-person conference that was waylaid by a global pandemic, but then turning around and continuing forward to plan this virtual event. And so we are here, and this is occurring in so many ways, very directly due to her hard work. And so she deserves quite a bit of thanks. Additionally, I'd love to also take a second to recognize and thank ISN, the Ignatian Solidarity Network, for all the hard work that they are doing for us specifically on social media. I wanted to take a second just because I think some folks may be more familiar with their work than others. Very often, ISN is known for its sort of big tent event, which is the Ignatian Family Teach-In for Justice. However, they are a font of resources, specifically on the connection between social justice, Catholic social teaching, and Ignatian spirituality. In particular, they have a wealth of information for folks at the high school, collegiate, and beyond level around topics of immigration, climate justice, criminal justice reform, and also are very good about responding to the crises and moments of the day. So if you are in the classroom, if you are a person of faith who cares about these things, I would encourage you to check out their website and support them and utilize their resources. They are in so many ways combining some of the best and the brightest of our Ignatian world in terms of addressing these issues and making them accessible in very powerful ways. So thank you again, Chris Kerr and company, for your hard work on social media. So just to let you know what this is going to look like, we'll be spending the next hour or so in conversation with Father Tom before we're going to close the session with a guided examen led by Dr. Kathleen Moss-Weigert. As you can see, the session is going to be recorded, and you'll have the opportunity to again ask questions, and you'll do so by putting them in the chat. Now we'll review the chat, try as much as possible to sort of pull out salient themes. I think right now we have 72 people present in the chat, I'm sure all with a wealth of questions that they have. I cannot necessarily guarantee that your specifically worded question will arrive, but we hope that we'll get to the spirit of it. That being said, we also hope that it is a lively and fruitful discourse and discussion in the chat as well, but would just lovingly remind folks that as faculty, staff, and students, both past and current of Jesuit institutions, how do we root our questions and root our conversations in the Ignatian presupposition? That is, in the spirit of assumed goodwill and curiosity, first and foremost. So without further ado, we will get things rolling. I am so grateful to be joined here today by Father Tom Smolich. Father Tom Smolich has been the International Director of Jesuit Refugee Services since October of 2015. He's a native of Sacramento, California, and before working with JIRS, he has served a Ministry of Community Development and Strategic Leadership that has included visitations in places as working such as Dolores Mission, being the provincial of the California province, and the president of the Jesuit Conference of the United States. Currently, again, he is coordinating and working with Jesuit Refugee Services, but he comes to us with a background including a Master's of Divinity from the Jesuit School of Theology of Santa Clara University, where I also got my MDiv, just had to call that out, an additional degree, an MBA from Stanford. He is an avid cook, gardener, and San Francisco Giants fan, and as we were just able to see in the last few minutes, a man of patience when it comes to technical difficulties. So without further ado, Father Tom, it's so good to have you with us here today.
It's great to be here with you, and sorry to keep you waiting. The audio problems are on my side.
Not at all. It's building up suspense, Tom, which is sort of the start for sort of any good conversation. And again, we would invite you all, again, hopefully you had the chance to, again, see Father Tom's plenary specifically on Ignatian spirituality and its challenges and how it can invite and inspire us to move forward and work for justice. And again, go ahead and start thinking about and putting your questions in the chat. I, however, have the privilege of being able to sort of address this first question, and we'll start from there. Father Tom, I want to thank you so much for your comments, the candor especially amongst them. I think you presenting this challenge of how we reach back to the Jesuit order's missionary roots as a way to address the temptation to fall to either this pole of secularization or fundamentalism was really great food for thought. Especially for me, it resonated. I was a college student at a Jesuit university when the institutional church was doing a lot of retrenchment, I think, in the face of, again, postmodern thought and sort of the reality of the world. And then later on, I was a campus minister when the sex abuse scandals were sort of really raging at the forefront of their, as they were being revealed. And as a result, I had a very strong experience, both myself and my students, of feeling like you really did have to pick. That there was either sort of this experience of faith that was very dogmatic and did not allow for a commitment to justice or a focus on the outside world, or alternatively, that to sort of move to a place where you could do justice work, there was not sort of space for you to authentically, especially, I think, be connected to an institutional church that in many ways was letting folks down left and right, and especially the folks that you were hoping to do work with. So your comments sort of challenging us to sort of find that middle way and path and think about what going to the frontiers in that work meant a great deal. In particular, though, I wanted to ask you, you encourage us to take a humble missionary stance when we're thinking again of that individual that you invited us to connect to via the composition of place. The person who, again, is in a place sort of fear and anxiety that might find themselves sort of marching forward to the Capitol and having a humble iteration and sort of missionary stance when it comes to working with them. In our previous plenary, I'm thinking of Margaret Fricci's comments about how our students, especially our LGBTQ and students of color, are demanding that we do better. What does that same missionary sort of attunement of Ignatian spirituality look like when negotiating those poles, especially when dealing with the questions that we have from our students, especially LGBTQ, especially students of color, who rightfully so have been harmed by previous iterations of and current iterations of some of what the church has done. What does that same missionary spirit look like when working with them?
Thanks for the question. And as I think most of you know, I've been in Rome for a number of years. So I'm a little out of date on a lot of what's going on. But I think your point about LGBTQ students, someone else who feels marginalized, especially by some of the institutions that we are part of, the starting point has to be that person. What is her experience? How do I listen to what he is inviting me to hear? Accompanying that person, wherever that person's journey might go, and we would say wherever that person's faith journey might go, is what it's all about. I think especially right now, in this moment of, as I'm saying, the church as an institution doesn't have a whole bunch of credibility. That's not the starting place for most of the young people, a lot of the other people we live with. So I think, Pope Francis at his best does this. He starts with the person. His insight is that we've all received the mercy of God. We've got it. The challenge is to share it with one another. If we are willing to follow that conversation, then I think God will guide us in where we are supposed to go. And honestly, it's not always popular. And I know many of you are dealing with issues and situations that may not be popular in your particular communities. You are missionaries, and the missionary starts with the encounter of the actual person that you are dealing with, meeting with.
So our first question comes from Tim Hipskind, and it says specifically, Father Tom, I think I heard you say, if justice is not tethered to faith, we will have trouble with the questions of whose justice. Could you highlight that a little bit more because it seems, at least to Tim, that justice movements are fairly clear about who is the focus of their efforts. And he says, if he didn't sort of hear or understand you clearly, could you clarify?
I'm sorry, the feedback was a little strong.
Okay.
I didn't hear that. Whose idea of justice?
Yeah, Tim Hipskin asking questions about your comment saying that if justice is not tethered to faith, we will have trouble with questions about whose justice. And his question to your comment was, it seems that most justice movements are fairly clear about who is the focus of their efforts. So could you sort of clarify your point around that?
I'm getting on another computer. Can you just talk just a little bit? And then I'm going to get on another computer and then we can stop the feedback. Okay, hold on just a minute. Thanks.
Absolutely, no problem. The advantages of a globalized world are that we can have these broad and exceptional conversations. The disadvantages are that we are having it mediated specifically through the larger scale framework of the caprice of a laptop. Joe and Mike, I wonder if this is a good opportunity to give folks a preview of what's coming up on Monday, potentially.
And also maybe a commercial for our new video.
Actually, I would love to do that if I may. So this is Joe Orlando speaking, and I just want to say to everybody who's with us, we are really privileged, as I mentioned in my comments on Tuesday, that we stand on the shoulders of some amazing folks. Well, three of those amazing folks have put together a video about the beginnings. Kathleen Moss-Weigert, Dave McMenamin, and Jerry Kavanaugh of the Society of Jesus. And I actually just saw it, I think for the third or fourth time, as it was just sort of live premiered. Kathleen, Dave, and Jerry do a beautiful job kind of showing how this started. And it really was an inspiration for Father Paul Locatelli at the time of an anniversary coming up for Santa Clara University, but a way for each of the Jesuit universities in the United States to be called to explore how they live this commitment at the time. And then in regional conferences and ultimately in that national conference to bring that together and be inspired by Father Koldenbach. And then something happened. So they put a beautiful video together. It's now been posted on the Sketch site. Andrea's, yes, we do miss Father Locatelli, and we've lost a few greats from those early years. Bill Spohn, Pat Howell, Father Pat Howell, and we cherish their memories and what they did and we're carrying that forward. But that's the shout out for this beautiful video called The Beginnings, and you'll find that listed on the Sketch site. So you can go back to that anytime during the conference. So there's my little commercial about that for sure. Go see The Beginnings.
So, and on Monday, again, we will have an additional plenary topic that will be opening, and that I believe is our panel on racial justice, if I'm not incorrect.
We can't send out an announcement until we settle on a name.
Okay. And then also to Andrea, if you could, I know that this has been a question for folks in terms of a way to access someone's poster presentation, right? So this is a different format than your average conference. Obviously, you can't sort of easily stumble upon someone's work. So how would they access their colleagues' poster presentations?
Thanks, Susan. That's a great question. The poster presentations are incredible. So if you go into the Sketch, you should see just a little button you can press that says poster presentations, and you'll see about 80 of our colleagues' profiles. They will appear. And now it's just their names. So you actually have to look at their profile to see what their poster presentation is about. But our colleague Dave Opitz from Loyola, Maryland is actually putting together a library of all the poster presentations so that you know which colleague has which presentation. Those who submitted an actual video poster presentation, they're already all lined up on the YouTube page. And so you just, again, go to our YouTube page where you viewed Father Smolich's plenary today.
Okay, thanks so much, Andrea.
Mm-hmm. Father Smolich, how are we doing?
I'm trying. Give me 2 more minutes.
No problem.
Okay.
Well, I'll take another moment just to mention something that we're hoping everybody realizes, that because it's virtual, and this is the benefit, as Susan pointed out, there can be some challenges, but the benefit is that this is spaced out over these next 3 weeks. So there's 2 more weeks of this conference, and that means folks can still join. It's a complimentary registration. And there are some really important topics that are coming up, and these past topics will also be available. So just to be aware that others that you care about, or they're in your networks or you think might be interested, let them know, and we'll be welcoming them throughout. So I'm just gonna, I think Father Smolich is back, so I'll drop here.
Tom, how are you doing? Can you hear us?
Not great.
Okay. Well,
Let's go back to our previous one.
Okay.
Ask the question again slowly, and we'll try it again.
All right. And I also know that Tim put this in the chat to you as well, so you might be able to access or see it there. But he's explicitly asking for some clarification around your comment that if justice is not tethered to faith, we will have trouble with questions of Hugh's justice.
Great.
Yeah.
So here's my point on that question of justice not being tethered to faith. Because each of us can come at these questions from a different perspective. So what is just from my point of view? What is just from your point of view? How do we negotiate that? How do we argue about that? And I think a lot of the lack of dialogue going on right now is a lack of a real common foundation of what that common good means. I think as Catholic Jesuit schools, we would want to say that our Catholic identity, our Jesuit identity, is the foundation of what we are doing. And I would say, as long as we are saying it's fundamentally about Christ and what Christ's message is in the world, we have at least got the envelope to figure out a way to talk to one another. I think a lot of what we're seeing right now, and I'm not disagreeing with the grievances or the pain or the experience that people have had. But we can sometimes wind up in a situation of my hurt is worse than your hurt, or mine goes back longer than yours, or my issue is more important than yours. And that's why this whole combination of prayer, discernment in community becomes really, really important.
Thanks, Tom. I think to pivot off that perhaps, and I'm seeing this sort of dovetails into that well, with your recommendations again for a prayer, discernment, and that life in community, how do we account for and how do we deal with the dynamics of privilege, right? So it's easy to say that we can be in community, but without sort of an awareness or acknowledgement of privilege. How does discernment potentially look different? How does that look different when we're really thinking about sort of the invitation of Ignatian spirituality, as it also connects to an invitation for an awareness of privilege?
I don't know if we lost Tom again. I did notice, Susan, that.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Hold on, turn off the. Okay, try again. Can you try again, Father Tom?
Can you hear me now?
Yes, we've got a little bit of reverb.
It probably means there's more than one speaker on.
Can you hear me now?
Yes,
Voila.
there we go.
Sorry for these troubles. Now, I didn't hear the last question, so go for it.
Absolutely. So Father Tom, building off of what you just shared, and that specific invitation again to prayer, discernment, and life and community as sort of a guiding principle for inviting us to engage the service of faith. Where do questions of privilege and an awareness of privilege come into that, right? Because it's one thing to say we have the life and community, but without a recognition of privilege, especially I would argue white supremacy's impact as well, community becomes then just a buzzword and not a reality. Discernment, right? It can become very weighted if we're not sort of acknowledging dynamics of privilege. So how do you see, where is Ignatian spirituality's encounter with that question, and where is its invitation in terms of tackling it?
So you all know more about these challenges than I do. What I will say is our grappling with it in terms of JRS is trying to do accompaniment seriously, and that is really walking with people to hear their stories, to let the people that we serve, to let the people that we walk with, to let their voices be the voices that guide us. So I think in our role as faith leaders, in our role as campus ministers, in our role is as leaders, we have to listen to the stories of the people who we are accompanying. And they're not pretty. A lot of times they are quite difficult. And a lot of times they implicate us in terms of whether it be past behaviors or past attitudes. We're certainly seeing that in terms of a lot of the slavery dialogue, quite specifically, not just at Georgetown, but in the whole Jesuit world. So I think, again, it comes down to, am I really going to listen to you? If I'm not going to really listen, then there isn't going to be any dialogue, and I'm going to stay in my mode of privilege. Does the dialogue necessarily end the privilege? Does the dialogue necessarily get me past that? No, it's a trial and error, frankly. I think we all have a lot to learn. I still have a lot to learn when I meet the people that we serve and I hear their stories, when they say, this is helpful to us and this isn't. So I think the real question for us is, am I open to being challenged? If I'm not, and we all have ways that we aren't. So am I willing to do the examine? Am I willing to listen to another person's point of view and say, my life can be changed? We're back to this whole question, I think, of dialogue and accompaniment. So the examine is really important. I have to listen to, as I walk away from that conversation with that person who really challenged me, saying, you, Father Tom, or you, whoever, you have something, you don't understand what's going on because of X, Y, and Z. I have to reflect on that. And if I don't, then I'm being as unfair to that person as somebody else who may be more directly responsible for whatever happened is responsible as well. Dialogue and accompaniment.
Great, thanks. And I appreciate that, Father Tom. I think also in the nuancing of accompaniment is not just sort of a one and done event, right? It's the beginning of a long-term process that has to continue forward, because I think otherwise.
And I think the real danger, especially for us, who I will say for us in JRS, one of the temptations is that accompaniment makes me feel good. Mm-hmm. I feel good because I'm listening to you. I feel good, and that's the worst privilege of all. Frankly, it's the most, let's say, the most insulting privilege of all. That aren't I wonderful because I have lowered myself or extended myself. And I've done that. JRS has done it. And so part of it is, how do we listen not only to the person we're talking to, but listen to our own spirit saying, excuse me, and interrupt the dialogue.
Wonderful. Thank you, Father Tom. Again, I'm thinking about things like downward mobility, right? Which are sort of things that are common into Jesuit parlance, and yet can be very dangerous if not sort of examined through a lens of that ongoing dialogue, that ongoing question, especially for folks that hold, I think, dominant identities and oppressing identities. Julia and Andrea, you've been able to sort of monitor the chat. What are you seeing?
Thanks so much, Susan. This is Andrea. I love when I get questions in the chat that I also have myself. So I would love to raise this one up from Erica Kirby at Creighton University, who's actually chairing our Women in Leadership panel on the 22nd. But it was your quotation, the Catholic Church is not a doorway. but a stumbling block to the gospel. And as I am reading the Gospels in the Bible more broadly with my 9-year-old every night, I really caught on to that point too. So many of your suggestions at the end felt individual in terms of our prayer and faith. So what is the first step for the church as an institution to start being that doorway? Thank you, Erica. Father Time, are you with us?
Yes, yes. I think, again, and I want to be careful to not say that the church is not a stumbling block for everyone.
Mhm.
And certainly there are parts of the church, and in some communities, the church is actually quite vibrant. My point is, I think for a lot of the people in the circles that we are dealing with, the church is a stumbling block. So, and we're not going to go into the path of who is church and what is church. I think we're letting that kind of sit there. I think we have to find ways, in a sense, to, whether it is to break through that, to walk around that, to find doors, maybe on the other side of the building, on the other side of the space, where we can walk in and we can invite people to walk in with us. This is not to say that the church will ever be perfect at this, but I think many of you in your encounters with students and encounters with your peers are kind of like saying, I'm finding this really hard. Is there some other way that we can engage this question of discernment, of question of God? And I think as missionaries, we have to start where people are. Banging somebody's head against a stumbling block is not the way to make them feel welcome.
Thank you, Father Tom. Susan, the other question I'd love to lift up is the one from Father Ben Urmston, who is with us today. Hi, Father Ben.
Ben, nice to see you after many years. So,
Susan, do you see it in the chat there? As a professor of peace studies, I have to say I love this question. So thank you, Father Ben, so much for bringing this to us. I'll hand it to you, Susan.
I do, and it's in the chat for you too, Tom, if that's easier.
yeah.
Father Ben says, we are part of one human family and have a common home. This is central to our spirituality and seems to lead naturally to the idea of a world federation that could establish enforceable world law, be an alternative to war, and bring about a more inclusive distribution of wealth. Why don't we at least research current proposals? So I think that's posed to you. And I wonder too, if there's a question in your own experiences with JRS around sort of the intersection between Ignatian spirituality and these difficulties that we have of living in a globalized world.
Yeah, Ben, we've had this conversation off and on in various times, and I don't have an answer for it. I think what I would say is we can do better. I think we would look at different points in our history, even our fairly recent history, where we have done better. In one sense, I turn it to you in our university networks to say, what are the alternatives, and say, what are the ways that we can look at this in this particular context. But Ben, I would also go back to the point that I made. I'm not sure we have to get everyone on our side. I think the right number of people in the right situation can lead a group, can lead a community to a different place. And I think, the other piece of this is think globally, act locally. I think whatever we do on the local level ultimately is there. But yes, I would turn it over to the peers in the research area to say, what might this look like right now? But I think the key thing about Ignatian spirituality in this is that we find God in the world. So if the world is suffering, that means God is suffering. And if God is suffering, then we are really called to respond. Now, that might be controversial in some circles, but I think it is the way to make sure that religion doesn't become privatized and that our own spirituality does not become privatized. We find God in the world. That's Ignatius's gift. That was Father Rupe's clear experience in founding JRS. It's Pope Francis as well. I see a long question here.
Yeah, and I can sum it up for you, Father.
I think everybody can read that on the chat, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So it's essentially our colleague, Naomi, specifically from Loyola, New Orleans, says, you spent the bulk of your talk talking specifically about basically dialoguing across a shared common, Judeo-Christo frame.
Right.
But she's wondering, what does that look like specifically when you're in terms of this broader encounter with folks whose religious commitments actually aren't fundamentalists? So whether it's the Jewish folks with the consideration of Tikkun Olam, or even I would argue, and I think this is a great point, atheists who have a real commitment to building justice in the world because they do not believe that there is one to come. What does that look like? Where's the intersection with Ignatian spirituality around that, and where's there the invitation for that to show up on our campus?
So I think it's a great question, and Naomi, thank you for bringing that up. And this is a nuance which I might not have been clear enough in my presentation on. I am not saying that everybody has to be a person of faith. I'm not saying that at all. I am saying, though, that I think that we as leaders in Jesuit institutions, we at least have to deal with that struggle. We can't just sort of pawn it off or sort of settle for, what else might work. I think it's really important that if indeed Ben's idea of a world that's going to change, it has to be done across cultures. It has to be done across faiths. And I think this idea of working with people who, in a sense, come to their own, however they come to that belief, we obviously want to work with them. My primary example of this is what used to be called PICO, which is now called PACT, I think, which started out as typical community-based organizing, but then moved to church-based organizing. And church was big. It was everything from you name it to this end to the other end of the spectrum. But finding areas that people could work together, and out of that local empowerment, you bring people of different faiths or even no faith. But I think the real risk here is to sort of just, like I said, not engage it. And then I think we can sometimes wind up in this kind of unreflected sort of, I've always done it this way, so I'm going to keep doing it this way. And I think the other reason to do it, and I appreciate, as you said, not all non-Catholic faith is fundamentalism. Absolutely right. There's a lot of Catholic fundamentalists too. So it really is, if I'm going to invite whatever that ism might be to a deeper dialogue, then I have to have done the deeper dialogue work myself, wherever that might lead me. I know some dear friends for whom it has led them out of the Catholic Church into a different faith community or a different style, whatever that might be. But we have to do the work. If we don't do the work, we can't engage others as they are doing their work and build those common bonds.
Julie and Andrew, I'm wondering if you all are seeing any other sort of direct questions to you. If not, I believe that I have one. I'll wait to make sure that you all aren't sitting on one.
I have not, but I actually want to follow up with what you just said, that we have to do the work. I am in community engagement work, and I've had conversations with colleagues across our network as we kind of almost prided ourselves on doing social justice work. How are we involved? But over the years, we've seen colleagues at public institutions, at other private institutions, also taking up the mantle of social justice work. And so we have started the dialogue around what does then Jesuit community engagement, how is it distinguished from other types? And I feel like faith has a large part of that. And so I'd really love to hear your comments around that.
Sure, sure. Julia, thank you. And I think it's a really important question. There's a Catholic question in there, which let's park to the side and talk a little bit about the Jesuit question. And the reason in my talk, I made that extensive quotation from Miguel Elizondo, which was that retreat that I mentioned in 1969. It was very important for the creation of the UCA, is because it's one of the best summaries of this dynamic of the Lord being present, God being present in this world, being called to co-labor with God. And I think we could even argue, is not the right word, that might be something which could be understood or acceptable even in some other faith traditions as well. I think another way to look at it, and especially given the point that the three folks made in the beginnings conversation about, I forget which of you said it, the importance of what our students become. I also spent some time on that. I think, we often talk about mystics as being people who are, up in the clouds and having visions and things like that. Ignatian mysticism, and I'm using that word quite deliberately, it's a service mysticism. It's a mysticism of service. It's an encounter with God in the world. Ignatius, though he certainly had some what others might call those sorts of mystical experience, his profound mystical experience was God being present here and now. So I think that's the Jesuit piece, Julia, is that wherever we are going to look for God, it's in the world that we are in. Now, God, as she or he we experience that God, may invite us to a different place, and that's totally great. But I think what's distinctive about this is we start there, and we keep finding God there.
So Father Time, I'm mindful of time, and unfortunately the trials and travails of modern technology stole some time from us, but I hope that folks will reach out to you in forms to continue the conversation. But sort of a closing question that we asked you to reflect on before we move towards our examen. Some of the conversations that have been coming up, right, as we, at least in the United States, are poised. The city of Chicago will be moving to phase 5, everything back to normal. Most of us, I think, will be returning back in vivo into campuses as well. And conversation came up again on our first day, particular of how do we acknowledge, in particular, that the pandemic and so many other pieces and elements of this last season are not just a blip, right? That this is not a thing that passes and then we move into this previous reality, but rather an invitation to a long and enduring change. So if we were to take seriously this idea that the pandemic was, again, as I think it was Margaret Ricci who said, it's a cannonball moment. This is an opportunity potentially for us to think about what long, ongoing commitments will come from this. What does, again, that missionary attitude of Ignatian spirituality, how might it approach the invitations of sort of viewing the pandemic through the lens of being a cannonball moment, as opposed to something that we have survived and are now moving through?
Thank you, Susan. I think that's a terrific question. And it's something I think we're dealing with here as the possibility of travel opens up again. And for JRS, most of us are travel junkies. So the idea of being able to get back on the road excites people to no end. And we're saying we can't go traveling the way that we used to. So we are dealing with this. I know exactly what you are. I mean, we have a similar experience. I'm going to go out on a limb here and say, and I don't want to get into the question of a personalized devil. I think there is an evil spirit or a less than positive spirit that would say we can go back to the way things were. And I think we need to acknowledge that that is a negative spirit. That is not a good spirit. Because going back to the way things were, in a sense, enshrines, shall we say, the way things were. And all of us are at this conference because we know that things should not stay the way things were. So, back to the conversation that was taking place last night, or pardon me, 2 nights ago in response to Father Sosa's talk in the Universal Apostolic Preferences. I really think the first one is the key one. What are we at John Carroll? What are we at Creighton? What are we at Seattle U in our experience of this COVID phenomenon? Where are we being called to really look at where we will not let things go back? The UAPs would invite us to specifically look at where they will not go back in terms of marginalized people, in terms of youth, in terms of the environment. What that looks like in any particular place is going to vary somewhat. But I think the sort of insight here is that if we try and take it all on, I think we're going to find ourselves really frustrated and burned out, because there is this very strong spirit out there that wants things to go back. Where do we find the grace going on in our location to say, this is where we need to move? This is where my campus needs to move. Maybe it's domestic, maybe it's international, maybe it's on gender issues, whatever it might be. But I think the discernment has to go on where each of you is. And the grace, if we can pull this off, to consistently do it, I think the good spirit will have more room to move. And we get closer to that 25 or 30% that actually can tip things over.
Thank you so much, Father Tom. I think especially that image, I think, is very enduring of this idea of, it's a temptation of the evil spirit. I think of Lisa Fulham, who actually teaches at our alma mater, who says that the sort of sinister thing about the evil spirit is it's not always lying. It's often presenting you with very viable options. So thank you for that insight. But most importantly, thank you for the gift of your time. Thank you for the gift of your frank words and your challenge to us to encounter these things. So I would invite us all now, again, in the Ignatian tradition, we're now going to be taking a moment for the examen. And for those of you who may, for whatever reason, not be familiar with the examen, it is a foundational element of Ignatian spirituality and practice. If you're unacquainted, it's a reflective prayer practice that focuses on attuning yourself to the presence of God, or the good as you understand it, and the movements of grace in our daily life. So today's examen will be led by Kathleen Maas-Weigert, Professor Emerita of Loyola University Chicago. Invite her to come to the screen as I let you know a little bit more about her. Kathleen, again, was, before coming to Loyola University Chicago, where I had the pleasure of encountering her, was the founding director of the Center for Social Justice Research, Teaching, and Service at Georgetown. And in her own words, previous to that, was at Notre Dame for something like half a millennia. She is a font of wit and grace and insight, and several of you had the pleasure of seeing her reflect upon the origin of this conference. And so I would invite her to the screen to lead us in a guided examen, and then we'll have a few concluding remarks and end our time together.
Thanks, Susan. A preliminary thought. I was reflecting on Deborah Mooney's suggestion the other day of cura propria, care for the self, and I thought, wow, the examen fits so well with that. So let's transition now by reminding ourselves that we are in the presence of a God who loves us and cares for us. It's always good to start with some deep breaths to release all that is washing over us, from the global pandemic to our polarized world, to the struggle for racial justice, to the stresses and worries in each of our own lives. So let's take a moment or two to breathe deeply, to release all of that, and to be present to our God. We begin with gratitude. We have so much to be grateful for. But let's start with the gratitude for what we have just received in Tom's inspiring presentation. Gratitude for what stretched us, for thinking anew about the service of faith, the challenge to reimagine a way of proceeding, the joy of being on this journey with each other. Let's take a moment to just reflect on our gratitude for Tom's insights and challenges to us. Let's express our gratitude for the other benefits, as St. Ignatius would have called them, or what we might call the good things that happened during this day. The sounds, the sights, the smells, the conversations. And as we recall whatever they are, let's relish them for a second. Part of those good things is our own behavior. Let's notice those joyful moments of this day when we responded in generosity to the Spirit, or when we graciously received and acknowledged the generosity of others to us. We turn our attention now to ask for the grace to consider those moments when we were less open to the Spirit, less loving than we might have been this day. And we humbly ask for God's healing forgiveness for those failings. And knowing we are loved and forgiven, we look ahead and ask for the courage and strength to listen to the stories of those we encounter, to hear the cries of those suffering, to continue to accompany others, to live in the spirit of the missionary impulse, to go where the Spirit is asking us to go now in our daily lives, in our work environments, in our communities, and in our solidarity with the most vulnerable here and in our global family. And in closing, we thank God for these moments together, and we ask for God's grace, in the words of the prophet Micah, to do justice, to love kindness, and to walk humbly with our God this day and always. Amen.
Amen. Thank you again, Kathleen and Tom, for your wisdom, your insights. And we will see you all again on Monday when our next plenary will be available, along with the talkback. And just as a reminder, all of these plenaries will be available. So we encourage you to think about, what does cultivating that 30% on your own campus look like? How can these be resources to you? How can you think about this conference as the invitation to an ongoing work, rather than just a simple commitment in the middle of your summer. So thank you, and we'll see you on the other side of this weekend.